morning. I know that I'm the last speaker and it's wintry weather outside, so I'll do my best to be brief. John had a very wonderful introduction. Thank you. As he alluded to, I had a very busy year. I had chose to go back to law school a little later in life. I'm happily married. I've been married for 19 years this August. We have 3 kids. My oldest daughter wanted to join me this morning on the political circuit, so she went with the straw poll this morning as we did that, and then I journeyed down here. And I wish I could say that we were as a well-oiled machine in Harrisburg as we were this morning, because I believe I arrived exactly 1 minute early to the time that I told John that I would. So things don't always work that well in Harrisburg, but I do want to provide some hope, which I'll get to in a minute. But one of the reasons that I'm in Harrisburg is actually with me this morning. When I was in law school, I became very frustrated with government in general, whether it be at the state level, the local level, or whether it be at the federal level. I had volunteered locally, and when I started law school, I'd been married for some time. I convinced my wife that I should quit my perfectly stable job with good pay, good benefits, and said, I got a great idea. Why don't you support me while I go back to school? And thankfully, she said yes. In my 3rd year of law school, at that point, we'd had my daughter right as I started law school. My son was born in September. I announced in November, and then I proceeded to run a campaign my 3rd year in law school while we headed into primary season. I graduated on Saturday. Tuesday, right before that, I had won the primary, as John alluded to. So, interesting enough, my campaign team kept telling me, you have to quit law school, you can't finish that. And I said, no. I said, because if I quit now, win or lose, I'd never go back. So I knew that if I was going to do it, I was going to do it my way and on the terms that I wanted to. And the reason I share all of that is because my kids and my wife, and more importantly, the life that we share here in the Commonwealth, is the reason that I chose to enter public service. And what I want to share is a little bit that you probably don't hear about in Harrisburg. How many people have become frustrated with the gridlock at the federal level? I knew there'd be plenty of hands on that. Without a doubt, politics has certainly become very partisan. And I have good news. And that is that not every issue is like that in Harrisburg. Recently, I had the privilege of serving as the pro-life chairman in the House, and we recently have passed a series of bills in response to the tragedy that occurred down in Philadelphia. And the good news is each of those bills passed overwhelmingly. And I'm not talking just 110 votes, 120 votes out of a 203-member chamber. I'm talking 140 votes, 150 votes, and with strong bipartisan support. And I think that's important. Many of my colleagues are here this morning. One of my former colleagues, Representative Hershey, who I had the privilege of serving with. And it's a good legacy to have in the House, to know that an issue that is that important that we can work together on. And believe it or not, despite the media not reporting on it, we've also tackled items like welfare reform in a bipartisan manner. We've also tackled issues of fiscal responsibility and debt reduction in a bipartisan and strong manner. And that's what I want to encourage all of us, because regardless of our political affiliation, I think that we can hit a point with members of both sides of the chamber. We can go to them and say, look, we may not agree on everything, but whatever it is we do agree on, let's find some common ground on this particular issue, whatever it might be. And it's something that I think that we desperately need in today's political environment. I recognize that we can't find a middle ground on everything. There are some moral absolutes that we hold near and dear to ourselves, and we have to be able to govern without compromising those on our individual level. But that doesn't mean that we become ineffective, and that doesn't mean that we can't work together to solve those things where we can find agreement. And I wanted to provide that note of encouragement, because it's a privilege to work with John and Becky and the rest of the Chester County delegation. They're a good, solid group. You take Chester County, Lancaster County, York County. We've got a solid block of votes there, and we can affect some real change, whether it be on the education funding formula, whether it's the budget, whether it's the conservative issues that are our time, that are defining our time. We have major issues that we have to tackle. Pension reform, we have to tackle it. It directly impacts the budget, directly impacts property taxes. And it's going to take a bipartisan cooperation along those lines. I think that it's something that we can do. And I think that the bills that we continue to work on will probably still continue to fly under the radar, unfortunately. Because let's be honest, partisanship sells. That's what the news reports. But I encourage you to, wherever you live, wherever you work, contact your legislator, build that relationship. It's something that needs to happen before whatever the particular issue is that you want to engage might come up. We're expected to vote on things, everything that occurs within the boundaries of the state. I grew up in Lancaster County. I understand ag. I grew up on a dairy, working on a dairy farm through high school. And that's an easy one for me to understand. I'll be the first to admit I didn't know anything about coal mining when I went to the General Assembly. So I went and found people who did understand coal mining. I talked to individuals who worked in mines. I talked to individuals who ran mines. Those are the kinds of relationships that we all have. And I know that you're all experts in whatever field that you are in. So I encourage you, call your legislator and offer to be a resource. Offer to be a resource to them to say, hey, I work in the healthcare industry. That's where I happen to come from. And say, that is something that I understand. I think that there's some areas that we could improve. Let me give you my suggestions. Or if you ever have a question about how a bill would impact the healthcare industry, or if you work, in the ag industry, make yourself available. I recognize it's going to take time, but it's time that's well invested, and it's time that will ultimately solve the problems. One of my things that I typically try to always do is leave plenty of time for questions, and I cleared it with Gwen before I did this. I promised that I would leave a few minutes for questions. If anybody has questions about particular bills that might be pending or issues that might be pending in the House, I'll be happy to try to field them. And if they get real difficult, I'll just dish it to the home delegation and then go ahead and say I have to leave because of the weather. So, anybody? Great question. The question involves education funding and whether or not it's actually been cut. I can tell you that the level of state dollars that is currently being spent in this year's budget, and I expect it to stay the same in the upcoming budget, probably with an increase because it's increased every year recently, is the same as the state level spending plus the stimulus money. In other words, we've reached the levels that were under the last few years of Governor Rendell. That's the first point. The second point is the funding formula is not fair. Under the current system, we fund districts, not students. And that's important because those of us who have growing school districts, our student population is growing quicker than the rate of inflation, and we might get a 1% or a 2% increase. Well, what happens is we make that up, and I'll speak locally. In Solanco, we make that up with property taxes. That's where it comes from. That's where the gap is made up from. There are school districts in parts of the state that are losing students but are guaranteed the same amount of money every year plus an increase. That's what needs fixed. That's why we can't fund districts, we must fund students. And then the third piece of that, the biggest piece that keeps eating into the education funding formula, we spent about, it was a little over $10 billion in the budget last year on education in a $27 billion budget. It's the second largest expenditure that we have. Of that, 1.2 billion, I believe, was a pension increase, cost to carry for pension costs. That was the required state contribution. That was about a $300 million increase. So we went from 900 million to about 1.2. That's projected to go up another 500 million this year. So in other words, while we're putting more and more money into that, pensions are certainly eating into a piece of it, and then the money that's left is being distributed unfairly. Yes, great question though. Other questions? I want to be mindful of the time, so we have 2 minutes according to my according to mine. Yes. Liquor Control Board, what are the hopes of getting rid of it? Well, I can say I've already voted to do that. Unfortunately, the bill is currently in the Senate, and I know that discussions are ongoing. I don't know what the compromise will look like. I've read several articles in the last week that they've had a series of meetings. I think something will be done. I mean, we're one of 2 states left that has a control system in place like we do currently. Personally, I'm a believer that we can't be in the business of enforcement at the same time that we're encouraging sales. There's a huge internal conflict of interest there. I think ultimately that wins out. That wins the argument with a lot of folks. I had 2/3 of my pastors at a pastoral breakfast. They questioned why the government's essentially subsidizing and encouraging the consumption of alcohol, and that was kind of the eye opener for me. I'm always a big fan of small government. I had to be careful how I said that because I don't think that we should be focusing on anything other than our core functions until we get those right, and I don't think selling liquor is one of them. So I'm hopeful that something will come out of the negotiations as we go forward. We had a strong vote, 105, I believe, out of the House, and I think that hopefully we'll see something be proposed in the governor's budget address in the upcoming cycle, which is next week. Yep, absolutely.